Okay, so these are the impacts that the Dodd-Frank Act had on executive compensation. The act as a whole was a huge overhaul on financial regulations, and it was a pretty broad in scope, but um, it did target the executive compensation in a number of ways. So basically, shareholders had to vote at a minimum of every 3 years on the executive compensation that the executives were receiving. And this could be shortened. It could be done annually or biannually, um, or rather every 2 years. Um, but it was required that it was done every 3 years. It was also required that they vote on the frequency of these every 6 years. And this not only included just regular compensation, but golden parachute compensation as well. And brokers were not allowed to vote on it. So, along with the other aspects of executive compensation that were affected, um, the act as a whole set standards for compensation committees and basically promoted social responsibility and ethical action of corporations, and it did this in a number of ways. But a lot of the text deals with transparency and implementing policies that um, ensure that information is disclosed to the parties involved so that everyone knows what's happening exactly. A big aspect of this was clawback policies, and that basically ensured that if a company was to underperform, then the uh, overcompensation uh, to the executives and the CEO would then be taken back after it was confirmed that uh, the CEO had been ineffective. And again, this was judged every 3 years. So this slide is just a comparison of the top 10 Fortune 500 companies at the moment and their average exec compensation and median exec compensation, as well as their total shareholder return. Again, that is uh, calculated by subtracting the share price at the beginning of the period from the end of the period and adding the dividends and then dividing everything by the share price at the beginning of the period.
When we look at executive pay packages since the passing of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and the Consumer Protection Act in 2010, we see not necessarily a commonality amongst all of the companies that we research, but we do see a general trend within the majority of the companies. Um, Before the passage of those things, we saw executives being paid uh, a lot of it in cash, a lot of cash compensation, and not as much focus on equity compensation. But as you can see through the following slides, with these 10 companies that we researched, the passage of those acts seems to have placed more emphasis on top level executives being compensated with more equity.
In the early 2000s, Apple offered Steve Jobs 10 million shares of stock and a Gulfstream 5 plane as compensation for the work he had done, since he agreed to only have a salary of $1 per year so that they could put the money towards his salary back towards the company to create even more return on investment for him than a regular salary would be. And when Jobs returned as CEO in 2011, the stock rose to $365 a share, and it was originally at $3.19 a share in 1997. So by 2011, Job shares were worth more than $2 billion.
So, in contrast with Steve Jobs' relatively minimal compensation and $1 salary, Tim Cook does take a salary and he does receive compensation as well. Since 2011, this is equal to up to 963.5 million. But this is by no means unethical or considered to be overcompensation. It's pretty standard for people at that level. And we can see that his compensation actually dropped 8% in 2019, which denotes that he is not one of those people who is just grabbing money as sales decline. So before we get to the impact of Frank Dodd on Apple, I'd like to kind of discuss the 2008 financial crisis. One of the biggest problems during this was the overvaluing of bonds. Bonds were being overvalued, and banks were buying these bonds pretty much totally unaware that the ratings were absolutely faulty. And so banks were buying these mortgage bonds, and that is essentially what caused the housing market to crash. Now, it wasn't directly the fault of banks for buying these bonds, because it was really the agencies that were rating the bonds who were primarily at fault, but executives, particularly bank executives, got blamed for this. And so after 2008, we saw kind of an anti-executive sentiment going on, which is part of what spawned the Frank Dodd Act. What really made people mad was that these executives were pretty much getting away clean, and they were still making millions despite, massive failure. So the Frank Dodd Act was essentially meant to fix what was perceived as executives getting overpaid. Like I said before, this was meant to encourage corporate social responsibility and ethical behavior, and stop companies like Enron, for example, from committing massive fraud. But the thing is, Apple wasn't doing any of these things. Steve Jobs was being very ethical and pouring all of his money into the company. And so when this was enacted and Tim Cook came into control, he did take a salary, but it didn't really have a major impact on how the company was run. So as we saw earlier, there's not a super distinguishable change between our recordings of executive compensation from 2007 to 2018. And this is due to the fact that most companies are not generally overpaying their executives. Their pay is mostly determined by the market, and in fact, it is beneficial to the company to not overpay executives. That's why people like Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg, for example, take salaries of $1 because it looks good and it shows investors that the CEO has the long-term fortune of the company in mind, and he's invested in that idea. So really, the only companies that might have really been affected by this will be companies like S&P with, bond rating agencies that are putting out faulty numbers. If the Dodd-Frank had actually been in effect at this time, we might have seen some of this compensation be returned. But for the most part, companies like Apple were not really affected by this because they were already practicing ethical behavior and paying their executives proportionately to the job that they were doing.